You'd think answering the question of what a biblical marriage is would be simple, but it's really not, because there is no actual definition of marriage in the Bible. We use Genesis 2:24 as if it was a definition, but it really isn't. It's an explanation of what is already happening. Here's the problem. Not everything in the Bible should be emulated. The Bible is not a record of what should have happened. It's a record of what did happen. That means there's enough bizarre stuff, especially about marriage, that you could basically make your own Game of Thrones series out of it. So because there's no definition, that means that we have to look closely at the types of marriages that are actually recorded in Scripture. Now this is made more difficult because most of them are actually glossed over in less than a verse, sometimes not barely even mentioned. The best examples that we have are the patriarchs, which unfortunately come at the very earliest section of the recorded time. Because there's all of these good marriages, bad marriages, and who knows what that is marriage wrapped up in the Bible, it's hard to tell what exactly God actually wants without some form of a definition. But fortunately, there's a few things we can do to help. First, if God is a realist and is moving people toward a goal, then we can expect that there will be movement in how marriage is treated in the Bible as time progresses. Second, we can also trust that there will be a difference between the surrounding culture and God's people as God slowly moves his people toward where they're supposed to go. So what was marriage like in surrounding cultures? If you haven't already, there's a couple of videos that you might want to check out. These will give a context to what we're talking about today. Marriage in the surrounding culture was community as the authority, and pretty much the only authority, actually. It was also still very much treaty-based, that it was an arrangement between families. Love and affection didn't have nearly as much to do with it as whether that marriage would be profitable for the two families involved. There was also minimal ceremony. Sexual fidelity was not actually required in marriage. There were a variety of ways that you could have sex with people that weren't your spouse, and ways that you could get multiple spouses. This was perfectly normal. So how is the Bible different? Well, sadly, the Bible actually matches the surrounding culture in many ways. The Bible retains the patriarchal nature of the surrounding cultures. The word for wife is isha. Isha means woman. It takes on the meaning of wife when it is coupled with a man's name, or he. So when it says that a patriarch took someone as his wife, it literally reads, he took her as his woman. Can't get much more sexist than that. In the Bible, women do seem to get more of a say in whether they want to get married or not. Rebecca, for instance, gets to decide if she will go to Jacob. While ceremony was minimal for marriage, one of the things that did usually happen is some form of a bride price was paid. The family of the groom would pay some amount of money to the family of the bride to get the bride. An example of this custom is when the father of Shechem came to Jacob after the rape of Dinah. The father said that he would pay any amount of a bride price if only his son could have Dinah. Leaving Laban's household, Rachel and Leah both complained, saying, haven't we already been sold by our father? This has led many people and some scholars to view marriage in the Bible as basically the purchase of a woman, and women would be considered merely property. While I don't want to shove under the table the patriarchal system and the sexism that is in the Bible and did exist at that time, I also think there's a better explanation. Marriages were arrangements and treaties between families. The particular type of treaties during that time period were called covenants. If you wanted to make the strongest agreement you possibly could with your neighbor, you married your son to his daughter, or vice versa. That marriage could symbolize a whole series of other treaties that are all wrapped up and kept in check by that marriage. The story of Dinah is actually very good at illustrating this. The families bartered back and forth on a series of agreements that then would be finalized in the marriage of Dinah and Shechem. The marriage in this situation was a linchpin for everything else that had also been agreed upon. In this sense, yes, the members of the marriage were pawns, but they weren't property, and an exchange of gifts was a very common and notable part of any covenant agreement, whether between nations or families. The bride price most likely played a role as a part of the covenant ceremony and the exchange of gifts, as opposed to directly purchasing the bride. It should also be noted that the men weren't necessarily always invited for their opinion on marriage either. For instance, when Rebecca came back as a bride for Isaac, Isaac didn't get a say She got a say in whether she would go with him. He did not. Now, the history of Israel is also deeply tied in with the history of the land of Israel, with all of the land allotted to specific families. Inheritance mattered to Israel, more than it mattered even to the surrounding cultures. Being able to pass on your legacy was important, but being able to pass on your land to your descendants was critical. This desperate need for a son gave rise to two of the strangest marriage customs in Israel. First, polygamy. Now, polygamy is never directly endorsed, but it definitely happens. But the main reasons for it happening, barrenness, for instance, the case of Jacob. If your wife couldn't conceive, you could have a second wife who could conceive and give you an inheritance. A second reason to have multiple wives would be in the case of you needing multiple treaties, that if you are a king or a lord, for instance, Solomon, having 700 noble wives, each of which has some treaty attached to it. And then third is just as an expression of power and wealth, though this is much less common in the Old Testament than it is in the surrounding cultures. And by the time of the New Testament, polygamy was pretty much completely gone. The second strange marital practice in Israel was Levirate marriage. This type of marriage happened when if a man is married and he dies before he gives an heir, then his brother will marry his wife and try and father kids for him. The idea is that you have an inheritance in your name even if you die. This is the law that the book of Ruth is based around, that Boaz was acting as a kinsman redeemer in Levirate marriage for Ruth. It is really unclear how often this was practiced, and in fact, Leviticus 18:16 directly condemns doing this exact thing that Deuteronomy says you should. But regardless, I think we can safely say that marrying your sister-in-law to father kids for your dead brother is pretty weird. There are a lot of versions of marriage in the Bible that we don't wish to emulate, but in general, monogamy was the norm. There does not appear to be much in the way of ceremony related to this, though. If everyone agrees that they were married, they would be married. Usually, there would be some form of a feast to celebrate, and then the couple would have sex. That seems to be it. Isaac took Rebekah to be his wife just after having seen her come off her donkey. And the way they got married was he simply took her into his mom's tent. His mom was dead already, don't get weirded out. And then they slept together and were married. Jacob had a feast, had sex, and was married. That having sex was apparently binding enough that he couldn't get out of it, even though it was the wrong sister that he'd slept with. How drunk do you have to be for that? Seriously. But there certainly wasn't anything about the government being involved, and there wasn't even anything about God being involved in these early marriages. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when God presiding over marriage started to really become a big thing. It certainly seems to be a later development than even the Davidic time period. Larger weddings and more important ones might have a formal treaty signing related to it, but usually it was just a verbal agreement that was capped by the couple getting together and having sex. We put so much formality into it today, but that's really all there seems to be in the Old Testament. You claim someone as your woman and then you have sex. King David had Bathsheba brought to his house and she became his woman. That's all it says. That's all that happened because that's all that was necessary. The Bible puts a lot of focus into protecting the sexual relationship of marriage. That basically all of the loopholes that you find in the surrounding countries, the law removes. So the only person that you are supposed to be having sex with is your spouse, according to the Bible. Now, this was really bizarre. This is perhaps one of the most fundamental differences about biblical marriage, is that it wasn't just you're supposed to live with this person and have kids by this person. This is the person you're supposed to have sex with. Nobody else. And yet, with all this talk about different ways that you're not supposed to have sex, different things that also count as adultery, with sheep, with guys, as a cultic ritual, with your stepmom, with prostitutes, all of these different things count, and none of them are okay. All of these loopholes that other cultures had, the Bible closes down. Monogamy, applying not just to one wife, but one sexual partner, is very distinctive of the Bible as opposed to the surrounding cultures. Oddly enough, though, with all this talk of sex, the Bible does not talk about premarital sex very often. The best explanation for why the Bible doesn't talk about premarital sex when it's so concerned with sex within marriage is because sex was how you got married. Saying premarital sex to an ancient Israelite would be as completely foreign as somebody asking you, well, I signed the wedding certificate before I got married a few times, but what's the big deal? No, you can't do that. Signing the wedding certificate is how you got married. Having sex in that day and age was how you got married. You couldn't have premarital sex. That was not possible because the very act of having sex made you married. The provision for checking the sheets of the marital bed to make sure that the hymen of the woman had broken, that she was a virgin for the first time, which there's so many problems with that, it's not even funny, was basically making sure that they were the first ones who had signed the marriage certificate, so to speak, that she hadn't been married to someone else beforehand. This bonding of sex and marriage, and so sex is only to be found within the context of marriage, seems to have created a marriage focused more on intimacy than many of the surrounding cultures. Love, for instance, is mentioned more often than one would expect when talking about marriage in the Old Testament. Slowly, the reasons why it was acceptable to divorce began shrinking and shrinking, as a devoted married couple came to be seen more as a wonderful mystery of God and not just as a practical arrangement between two families. We see this evolution in what marriage became in Genesis 2. In Hebrew, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, any blank of blank is how they say the superlative, how they say best, most. Light of lights would be brightest light. So when Adam says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, he sees her and goes, oh my word, you are the hottest thing I have ever seen on this planet, and I have looked at every one of the animals. You are the completion and the superlative to what I am. And for that reason, a man will leave his father and mother, join with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Two becoming one flesh is a very simple way of talking about sex, which would be the traditional foundation of marriage. However, by the time of Christ, we see a reinterpretation of the one flesh to not just mean a sexual activity, but now to relate more to a union of spirit and an intimacy than it ever had before. Jesus quotes this verse and reshapes it, not just in the light of women are hot and men want to have sex with them, but reshapes it into a statement of divine purpose, that they are meant to be united, not just physically, but in every way. Jesus shows the way that marriage had shifted in thinking from just a smashing of genitals to something that's more of a melding of souls. This becomes indicative not just of God's plan to create people, but for them to be reunited on a deeper level. Part of this comes because there aren't many good examples and no actual definitions of marriage in the Bible. So increasingly, people turn to how the Bible uses marriage as an analogy for how we talk about our relationship with God. By the time of the New Testament, marriage hadn't lost its treaty aspects, but the dominant image that everyone based their marriage off of had shifted from the marriages that they saw around them to the marriage with God. So our earthly marriages became many examples of God's love for us and relationship for us. Ephesians talks about our relationship with God and talks about using that as a model for marriage. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. That God's love for us becomes a model for our own love for each other. And love for each other in return illuminates God's love for us. Committed, self-giving, loving, eternal. And that is a very different place than where we started. But it's a much better place, and I think points to where God is leading us. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next video.